Let's just start. Let's read the text. In Siyam Parshas Vayechi, at the end of Vayechi, the Torah tells the story. Yosef had angesagt Yidden, Yosef had Tzaddik informed the Jewish people the Besura Sagiyula, the news of the eventual redemption. Quote, V'olikim, that God Almighty Pakod Yifked Eschem will remember you. V'hela Eschem and Arat Hazeis, and take you out of this land, V'goymen, and so forth. In other words, Azei Vele Nigel Veren, they will eventually be redeemed, Unareiskein from Golus Mitzrayim, and depart from the exile in Egypt. Right? So we know from all of our discussions that Yosef and his brothers represent Golus. But Yosef and his brothers represent Golus on a much more theoretical level than their descendants will. They represent Golus because they're disturbed by Golus, they're burdened by Golus. Their children are in Golus because they're going to suffer. They're going to be tortured. They're going to be exhausted by Golus. So Yosef is dying. He's passing away. Yaakov has already died. He died last week. Yosef is dying. And before he dies, he says to his brothers and to their children, how do I say this? It's going to get worse, but it's going to get better. When Yosef passes away, and his brothers pass away, and that whole generation is gone, and the new king, or a king who acts like he's new, reigns over Egypt, the goal is going to get worse. And Yosef says, listen, it's going to get really, really, really bad, but it's going to end. Right? Like I told you in the last class, Mashiach has to come. Because he's not being added to the world, he's the truth of the world itself. So the Rebbe observes, page 831, right column, 7th line. Saidi Yirida in Mitzrayim, both the initial descent into Egypt is Yekumen durch Yosef, happened because of Yosef. In other words, Sulibim, Zainin, Yekumen, Yankev, Avonav came Mitzrayim. He was the reason he went into Egypt in the first place. As you know what the Chazal say, Yaakov was supposed to go into Golus. He could have gone into Golus with shackles of iron as a slave. But because he was such a righteous person, the Eibishter found an honorable way to bring him into Golus. How? He had his son sent into exile, and his son reemerges 22 years after his disappearance, and he's the most powerful man in the world. He says, come live on the fat of the land with me, and of course they join him. Inside the Yitziyah from its time, as well as the exodus from Egypt, is Yekumen durch Yosef, has to do with Yosef. Erat ongezog di besura, he gave us the information that one day we will be redeemed, ungegeben dem simon, and he gave us the sign. So the Rebbe's question is, why? Why is Yosef the initiator of the Golus? And why is Yosef the predictor of the ultimate end of the Golus? Why does Yosef serve these two roles? So we read the next paragraph. Die Sheiches, this relationship, from Golus Mitzrayim, in Yitzias Mitzrayim to Yosef, to going into Egypt in the first place, and coming out of the Egypt ultimately, is linked to Yosef. To understand the connection between this phenomenon and Yosef HaTzadik, vet men verstehen behegdim. It requires that we first discuss something else. And what is that something else? The Maila von Yosef. And what was so unique about Yosef? Was in einike in Yonim, in certain ways, is der gestanden in a hechere Darge. He stood in a higher step. Nit nor von seine Brüder, die Shvatim, not only from his brothers, the tribes, nor eich von Yankov Avinu, also from Yankov Avinu. Was mitzadem, but because of this fact, was in Ruchnis, that spiritually speaking, if Geven, he was, Ben Yonim Anal, the aforementioned details, Hechef and Zay, above the brothers and even above his father, the Rebbe, therefore, is Eich in Gashmis, as a Geven B'Makam Malach, physically he was a king. Und die Shvatim und Eich Yankov, and the tribes and even their father Yankov, haben sich mishtachel Geven zu ihm bow down to Yosef HaTzadik. So we have to explore what is it about Yosef over his brothers and even Yankov, which makes him superior to all of them. And once we understand that, we'll understand why he's the one who brings us into Golus and takes us out of Golus. So we read 831, second column. Again, we continue with the underline. Wegen der Meile from Madreges Yosef, when we talk about what is advantageous about the level of Yosef, Oich die Madreges from the Shvatim und the Avis, it should probably be Oif, above the level of the Shvatim and even the level of the Avis. It's discussed in Chassidus at length. What are the saying in Hasidus? As the Aves and Shvatim, the patriarchs and the heads of the tribe, the fathers of the tribes, they were shepherds, and they were shepherds by choice. Why were they shepherds by choice? Because a shepherd is abgesundet von the Inyan Ha'elam, he's separate from matters of this world, which would disturb their avodah. What does the shepherd do? He takes his herd out onto the pasture, and he sits on the ground with his bugle, and he makes sure that no wolves come to eat up the sheep. That's about it. After they eat grass for a few hours, he leads them, and of course they follow him like sheep, to the water, they drink, and he takes them back onto the pasture and eats some more grass, and in the evening he brings them back home, and he corrals them and shows. The point is, when a person is a shepherd, they don't work too hard. Right? They're responsible for the sheep, but the work consists basically of waiting around and watching, so you can sit and meditate all day and all night. Aber Yosef, as opposed to Yosef, is given a Mishnah Lamelech. He was a vizier, he was a vice king, was a verbunden mit the größten Tiers, who was preoccupied with the greatest preoccupations, ubefraten Mitzrayim, particularly in the land of Egypt. Was wer gerufen was ha'aretz, it's called the most abominable place on the earth, 832 now, und doch, nevertheless, hat es nicht gestellt, it did not interfere, as Yosef so gleichzeitig, that Yosef should simultaneously euch stehen betachas of Vekas, also stand in the absolute attachedness to a lakusta godliness. Yosef was a multitasker. To him, there was no contradiction between being so involved in worldliness on the most worldly of levels and being davak and alakus. The Shvatim could do either, but they can't do both. Yosef had no contradictions. And the Rebbe says, and let me insert here, in this respect, he was not only higher than his brothers, he was even higher than Yankov. Yankov was much holier than the Shvatim, but in order for Yankov to be Yankov, he had to be involved in a very theoretical level of Golus, a very spiritual level of Golus. Yaakov would go into the darkness of Golus, he would become lost in it. Yosef HaTzadik is above, to use Hasidic terminology, he's above the level of above and below. And therefore there's no contradictions. 832, second paragraph, look inside. Das is Eichat Tam, this also explains the reason. Of them, on the fact, was the Teda itself, the Teda tells us. Yosef is Echam. Yosef recognized his brothers. Veheim lehi kiru. They did not recognize him. And the Rebbe says in Yiddish, as the breeder of Yosef and Nider Ken, the brothers could not recognize Yosef. Well, he recognized them. Now, why not? So Rashi says, because when Yosef left, he was 17 and didn't have a beard yet. And the brothers already had beards, they were older. So when they saw Yosef again with a beard, they didn't recognize him. But what is the Chasidus? What does it mean the brothers didn't recognize him? It's very simple. They couldn't imagine that it's possible. When you can't believe that something could be, you don't believe it. They couldn't imagine. As a Zozayin Meglach, it should be possible. As a dead Mishnah Lamelech sign that one could be the vizier, the wise king in Egypt. So Zozayin Yosef HaTzadik, and then still be Yosef who was righteous. But say they're in avodah because the way they serve Hashem is Welt Astira to Dveikes Nalakus. The world and serving God Almighty are contradictory. So in order to be able to be in the world and be holy, you have to be Yosef HaTzadik. They were not in the level of Yosef HaTzadik, so since they couldn't imagine it, they didn't believe it. Since in themselves they couldn't imagine how could you be so involved in the world and still remain the way you're supposed to be, so therefore couldn't believe it. I'll tell you an interesting thing. Parenthetically, many years ago I was in North Carolina for Rosh Hashanah. I went there to be a chazan. When I was 18 years old, Chabad house was the garage of the Shliach's house. So he said to me that in the South they have these Amway conventions, the pyramid. And he says, every year, one Shabbos, all these religious guys come from Williamsburg or Borough Park, they all belong to this pyramid, and they spend by him Shabbos. 20, 30, 40 people. He says, and one of them said to him, if I lived here in 6 months, I'd be a Machal Shabbos. I mean, today, North Carolina has all kinds of shluchim and a school and al-zachem. Then there was nothing. Nothing. How does a guy and a girl, a young couple, move to a place where they're everything and engage? They're involved. And it shouldn't affect them. So of course the answer is, it's the koiches of the Rebbe. It's the koiches of the Rebbe. And on a practical level, it's teifach hamnach latfiach. You make sure that you're constantly on offense. So long as you're giving, you're not able to take. That's the way the world works. So the brothers look at Yosef and they say, this is impossible. A Jew from Borough Park looks at Lubavitch and says, no way he's religious. Can't be. Can't be. Why not? Because I can't imagine it. But it was. Continues the Rebbe, 832 on the right, the lower paragraph, der mit vet mevuot, which explains another thing. Was the state that the Torah tells us, Eile Teldes Yaakov Yosef, that the offspring of Yaakov Avinu was Yosef. In other words, as Teldes Yaakov, the offspring of Yaakov, which the Rebbe interprets to mean the Giluyim from Yaakov Avinu, what's revealed from Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov was a very holy man. But Yaakov is a very holy man in a very holy world. But Yaakov and Yonam are in Atzilus. Yaakov is in a higher world than Atzilus. The offspring of Yaakov, to bring the godliness of Yaakov into the lower world, hat Yosef mamshich gewesen. Yosef drew down and carries down in the Elamis, Bria Yetzira Asiyah, into the lower worlds, Biz and Elam Azeh Hagashmi, until to this physical world. So Yaakov is very holy. The offspring of Yaakov is to bring that holiness into the lower worlds. Only Yosef is able to do it. Und dafke Yosef das gekannt tun, only Yosef can do it. Weil sein Madrege, because the level of Yosef is given in them inyan, was in this aspect noch hecher von Yaakov's Madrege, higher than Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov is holy in a holy world. The Shvatim are holy by isolating themselves in an unholy world. Yosef brings the holiness of Yaakov from a holy world into an unholy world, doesn't isolate himself, and remains just as holy. Der Vater hat sich gekent, Rablos and Niedrige. Yosef could descend so low. Wie der Klal, as it's explained in Chassidus, Kol HaGavaya, Gavaya B'Yosef, whatever has a higher source. Yered Lamata Mata, Yosef go even lower, and that's Yosef Atzaris. Let's talk this through. As far as Mitzrayim is concerned, Yaakov is not in Golus. As far as the Shvatim is concerned, they're in Golus. As far as Yosef is concerned, he's in Golus and he owns it. Yosef, therefore, is above both. Yaakov Avinu survives in Mitzrayim because he's not a part of it. The Shvatim survive in Mitzrayim by separating themselves from Mitzrayim. Yosef is in Mitzrayim and he masters Mitzrayim. He's above it all. Last year we learned all these Sichos where the Rebbe explains how Yosef did it. The Rebbe says some very wonderful things. And the essence of what the Rebbe says is that Yosef was able to accept his situation without fighting it. When the Eibishter gave him a challenge, anytime a person has a hardship, they resist it. When you resist it, you make it harder for yourself. Yosef had so much humility that whatever the Eibishter gave him, he accepted. And therefore, he not only survived it, he thrived in it. And here the Rebbe explains the ability for Yosef to be so involved in business and in politics and in worldly affairs and remain Yosef HaTzadik is because he was able to bridge the highest and the lowest. There were no contradictions in Yosef HaTzadik. Turn the page 834 now. Bottom of the page. Like that, now says the Rebbe, based on this, that when euch verstehen die Sheiches, we can also explain the relationship from Golus Mitzrayim, of our going into Egypt in the first place, mit Yetzias Mitzrayim, and our departure from Golus in the last place, to Yosef, and Dafka to Yosef. Why is it Yosef who brings us into the Golus, and why is it Yosef who takes us out of the Golus? And the answer is because Yosef can bridge both. The Rebbe says, the Kavonah from the Yerid in Golus, and went into Mitzrayim for a reason. Like, the Eibishter put us into Egypt. The Eibishter put us into Egypt for a purpose. And the purpose that something good should be achieved by going into Egypt and coming out of Egypt. So if the Eibishter takes such a risk, the Eibishter has to believe that the return is going to happen, right? A person doesn't gamble unless they think they're going to win. If the Eibishter puts us into Mitzrayim, and he puts us through the physical and spiritual challenges that we're going to endure and encounter, he has to have a pretty good idea that it's going to work out, correct? How does he guarantee that? And the answer is Yosef. Because we went into Egypt for a reason. Says the Rebbe is given Bechdei was for the purpose of to mitnemen von dar, to take out of Egypt dem rechush gadol, great wealth. That's haste, in other words. Top of 835 now, girls. To mevara zayin the nitutas hakadusha, to bring clarity to the sparks of holiness. When someone's like gefunden in Mitzrayim that found themselves in Egypt. We went into Mitzrayim to gain something. Go through incredible hardships to redeem something. Now let me stop for a moment, okay? Before this Sikha, before today, if I were to ask you, what was the purpose of Golus Mitzrayim? Why did we go into Egypt? What would you answer? I'll tell you what you're supposed to say, okay? And then you'll say it, so then I'll be right. Yeah? You're supposed to say, we went into Egypt till we should be born as a nation. The birth of the Jewish people had to go through this incredible hell on earth. Holy patriarchs and matriarchs already were. Avraham lived with Sarah, Yitzchak lived with Rivka, Yaakov lived with Rachel and Leah, their children lived. Now, to go from a handful of holy people to a nation of God, and the nation of God means tzaddik, bein and yirasha, righteous, evil, and in between, that even the worst Jew is a Jew, just like the best Jew is a Jew, requires a purging. That's Mitzrayim. Here the Rebbe says something different. The Rebbe says, yeah, sure, that's true. We went into Egypt to be born as a nation. We came out of Egypt in a position to receive something from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that would mean that Egypt itself gives us nothing. We leave Egypt behind. We don't take Egypt with us. That's not satisfactory. There's got to be, in addition to the birth of the Jewish nation, our going into Egypt has to involve taking something from Egypt. So here the Rebbe has a different idea, that in addition to the slavery in Egypt, creating the Jewish nation, the slavery in Egypt redeems the sparks of godliness that are lost in Egypt. The reason we have to go into Mitzrayim, to go through a hardship, to be born as a nation, is because the hardships in Egypt are not only because of the benefit it brings to the Jewish people, it's the benefit it brings to Egypt itself. The godly sparks which in Egypt become elevated through our visit to that place. Okay? Now, third line from the top of page 835. And when they finished, we brought clarity to the sparks, is given the Yule, the redemption happened. So, yes, going into Mitzrayim served the purpose of creating us as a nation, but going into Mitzrayim also served the purpose of extracting sparks. So here's the risk. We subject ourselves to the challenges of Egypt. And we failed. We became caught up in the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim, but in the end, so to speak, it's all worthwhile because we were redeemed, and we redeemed the sparks of Egypt. Turn the page. Now we're doing page 836. Suli dem Maila von Yosef of the others. It is specifically because of Yosef's advantage over the others, the Shvatim, and the tribes. And what is this advantage of Yosef over the Shvatim? Was by imat meir given azam adregen alakus, that in him personally shown such a high level of godliness, was his hecher von Welt, which is so much higher than the world, that he can actually master and conquer the world. This creates the possibility for us to go into and come out of Mitzrayim. You see, we went into Egypt, it didn't work out perfectly. The Jews became assimilated, they became slaves. Yosef went into Egypt, was as much a part of the melee, the tzara, the tumult of Egypt as anybody else, and he remained Yosef. He gives the koyach to go in and come out, because he personified it. He was it. He was a human being who was so great that you put him in the deepest darkness, he remains the same human being. We were not that great. We went into that darkness had an adverse effect. But we had to go into that darkness, not only to be born as a nation, but to extract those sparks. But how do we know we're going to succeed? How do we know it's going to end in the end of Yosef? Yosef himself is very much a part of the process, but he's a winner, and he guarantees that this will all end, and it will end in a favorable way. Therefore, says the Rebbe, this is the Rebbe's primary point, Yosef brings us into Mitzrayim, and Yosef brings us out of Mitzrayim. Because a person cannot get into a bad situation unless he knows before he gets in how he's going to get out. Right? One of the favorite words in American politics in the 1990s was exit strategy. Remember the words exit strategy? Actually, in the year 2000, we went into Iraq, we won the war, and we lost the peace. We've been doing it for 50 years. So when you get into a situation to get out of it, how do you get out? How do you get out? How do you get out? The answer is because you have somebody who's already out. Yosef has already demonstrated with his own person this ability to conquer and win Egypt and be above it, and he therefore is the one who can bring us into Egypt, because he's the one who can guarantee that it will finish. because he personally finished it. Therefore, Yosef starts the Golus, and Yosef predicts the end of the Golus. So this is similar to, but not the same as the point I told you last week. I don't know if you remember. Last week we had more time to learn a Sichos, so I got carried away. And at the end of the class, I told you a story with the Rebbe Rashab and the Soviets, how he made fun of them and he mocked them and he belittled them, and he was never punished because he passed away 2 weeks later. So I always interpret that to mean that Rebbe Rashab started up with the Russians, the Soviets. Why? Because that was not his challenge; it was his son's. And before the Golus started for the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab said, "This is nothing." And the Frierdiker Rebbe went through hell. But because a Rebbe, who was not a part of this Golus, was mevatel it, negated it so completely in its inception, he anticipated its eventual end. This is different and deeper. Why? Yaakov is able to be mevakesh as a ketz because he's not a part of the Golus. Yosef is a part of the Golus, and he's a winner. Last week's class described a tzaddik who sees his children going into an exile. He gives them a power to get past it because he's before it. Yosef is another story. He's a part of the Golus, and nevertheless he's a king. In other words, Yosef is greater than Yaakov. Yaakov's ability to see past Golus Mitzrayim, Yaakov's ability to see when Golus is going to end, is because it's not his Golus, it's his children's Golus. Yosef's ability to see past the Golus because he conquered the Golus. So that nobody is in a greater position to empower the Jewish people to survive the Golus, and therefore to bring them into that Golus in the first place with a guarantee you're going in, you're going to get out, than a person who's himself gone in and gotten out. So we're comparing Yosef to Yaakov. Last week's class was about Yaakov wanting to tell his children the end. And in doing so, he was hoping to hasten the end. And the Eibusher doesn't let him. But Yosef can, because Yosef is not above it and seeing beyond it. He's a part of it, and he masters it. He says, the koyach that I personally employed to conquer Egypt is going to give you the koyach to conquer Egypt and extricate yourself from it. And that's the difference between last week's Sicha, where Yaakov wishes and is not allowed, and this week's Sicha, where Yosef predicts it. Because since he's a part of the Golus, he can guarantee that the Golus is going to end. That's the Sicha. Now, but there's one more point that Rebbe makes. And I'm going to start again from the beginning of Sifches, bottom of page 836. To lider ma'ila for Yosef of the office and the Shvat. We now understand that obviously Yosef is above the fathers and the tribes, which is he represents such an incredibly high level of godliness. Was his hecher from Welt that's so much higher than the world that it can go through the world and win. Says the Rebbe, the father is oich the anhoga mo'mayla mitim, the way God treated him, given in an oifen from the mayla me'ateva, it was completely above nature. Yosef HaTzadik's life was completely above nature. And now the Rebbe says something incriminating about Yosef, something negative about Yosef. Listen to this. 837 at the top. Das ist echt der Tam. We all know the story of them, but Yosef HaTzadik is bestraft geworden. Yosef was punished for sein Betten dem Saramashkin, for asking the winemaker, the butler, soll ihm den Mannen verpassen. All know the story. Yosef sat in jail for 10 years. And then he interprets a dream for the butler and the baker. And he says to the butler, do me a favor. I've been here for 10 years. I'm guilty of no crime. Get me out of here. What happens? The Saramashka forgets him. He spends 2 additional years in prison, right? Why? What was Yosef's crime that caused him to sit in jail for 2 more years? And the teretz is, he didn't have complete trust in Hashem himself. To take him out of the prison. But their fad is ein einish gewesen, his punishment therefore was to bleiben, to remain ibedike 2 Jahre, an additional 2 years in Beis HaSurim, in this prison. So the Rebbe says, I don't understand. Isn't it true that a Jew is supposed to make a keli in Teva for his life? Is it not true that we're supposed to make a vessel in nature for the brachas of Hashem? It's a chiyuv, it's an obligation. What did Yosef do? He simply asked Saramashkim to help him. What's the crime? He's asking for help. He's supposed to ask for help. any vehicle, any means in nature a person can employ to help himself, which is in the parameters of Torah, which is kosher, you're supposed to employ, and Yosef is punished. Next column, the teretz is, not, the answer is, Val by der Madrege was Yosef angehalten. Since Yosef was such on a high level, wie gesagt, früher as described above, as Eres given Dovik in the Bechinas HaSeveh from Elikus. He was kept to the very highest levels of godliness. And what are the very highest levels of godliness? Was his Hecher Farmakar and Vrayim, which is completely removed from the limitations of creation. Says the Rebbe hat nicht gedarft ankommen zu Achonis, Bekelim, B'derech HaTeva. He didn't need nature to help himself, and therefore he was not allowed to use nature. It was therefore a demand on him a Hecher HaMadrege from B'tochen, a higher level of trust, which is on kein shum farmitlung, without any intervention for Natagas HaTeva of nature, and that's why he was punished. If you or I was sitting in jail, and the vice president showed up in prison for a 3-day sentence for jaywalking, and you said, listen, do me a favor, get me out of here, they'll be perfectly legitimate. Why? You're supposed to use Teva. But if you're Yosef HaTzadik, and you see who you are, you see that you're a total master of Teva, you're totally above it all, you have to trust Hashem, that Hashem is going to help you without any intervention. So Yosef is punished for doing something that if we would do, would be completely legitimate, because he's Yosef. Yosef is a Yid who bridges the highest of the high and the lowest of the low. There's nothing that can stop him from being Yosef HaTzadik. So what is expected of a person who has such koyches? What's expected of a person who has such koyches is to rely on God alone and no intervention from anybody or anything or intermediate at all. And he's punished because of that effort. So this is the Sikha. That's it, we're done. What does the Sikha teach us? The Sikha teaches us that Yaakov helps us by being above the Golus. Yosef helps us by being the conqueror of the Golus. When you see one Yid thrive and survive in Golus, that gives a koyach for the rest of us who are not doing so good to also come out of Golus and come out of Golus successfully.
I don't understand why the laws apply differently to a tzaddik. Like, isn't he still a person? Shouldn't he make a clean?
I got an email last night at midnight from a shliach who is an acquaintance. Can't call him a friend, but he's an acquaintance. And I responded angrily. Why did I respond angrily? Because I'm an angry guy, as you know. So I'm going to read you what this person wrote to me, and then I'm going to tell you what I wrote back. I'm not going to read it to you because you're going to get lost. And there's a very important point that has to be made here. Okay, Yossi. Are there non-Hasidic sources for the Tanya's concept for a tzaddik? Question mark. I have a student bothered by this Ubermensch. You know what Ubermensch means? More than person. It's German. Supermensch. Concept. That a person could be perfect, and would like to see the concept referenced in other sources. And then he goes on to tell me all this guy's problems. He's learning Torah from the Snagdim also, and therefore there's no such concept as a tzaddik, and he's very bothered by the Rebbe and all this other stuff. And the bottom line is, he is of the opinion that the Tanya is wrong because it doesn't make sense. So here's my response. I gave him some sources. He asked me for some sources in Nigla. I said, the Alter Rebbe on the first page of Tanya brings the Gemara in Brachas. The Alter Rebbe's first source for tzaddik is the Gemara in Brachas. But then I wrote the following. I told you I'm not going to read it, here I go. In addition to all of this, the form that he is using, Ubermensch, bothers me. This language, in this form, is based on a predefinition of what a human being is. We're deciding what a person is, and therefore asking a question. The Tanya is broadening the definition of a human being, not adding something superhuman. In other words, the very idea that we define humanity by the median level of what human beings around us are is an insult to the human potential. Especially in our times where there's so much perverseness and corruption that it's almost impossible to answer the question, what is really a human being? It is certainly impossible to answer the question, what is the maximum potential of a human being? So this is very pretentious. Now, I can't call him arrogant because he's not raising himself. To the contrary, he's belittling himself. But I can't call it presumptuous. And it is very predictable for someone of our era to assume that what he knows is the ultimate truth and what is not known by him is false. In my opinion, this is really what this person needs to hear. He doesn't need sources. He needs to do some introspection and to find a little humility. Did you understand what I just read? You're wrong. You're right, he's a person. But the meaning of the word person is far larger than anything you and I can fathom. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is also a person. But that doesn't make him like us. It makes the definition of man gigantic. And there are people who are so great that they relate to God and God alone, nothing in between, not even them. There are people who are not allowed to go to a doctor. Just like you must go to a doctor, there are people who are not allowed to go to a doctor. It's contradictory. No, it's not. It's levels.
Doesn't he know this?
Who?
Yosef.
Oh, so why did he do it? He has free will. He made a mistake. He was punished for it. And the same thing, Moshe Rabbeinu was punished for a similar mistake. Yankov Avinu was punished for a similar mistake. The question is why it was considered an infraction. Why it was considered an Aveda. And the answer is because when you're Yosef a tzaddik, you rely on God and God alone. If you did that, you'd be a fool.
Is there a source for that?
For what?
That he needs to rely on God alone?
The fact that he was punished is the source. His story in the Torah is a prototype. His story in the Torah teaches a lesson, not to me and you, but to people who are like Yosef a tzaddik. There's a Gemara in Masechta Tainis. You tell me Pshat in this Gemara. You ever heard of Nachamish Gamzu?
Yeah.
Gamzu Lateva guy, yeah? Okay, the Gemara about Nachamish Gamzu. He was very, very sick. He was very sick because something happened and somebody died because he took his time giving tzedakah, so he became very, very sick. He was in a churva. You know what a churva means? A collapsing building. Now what do you do when you're in a collapsing building? You don't know? Huh? A friend of mine would say, put an egg in your shoe and beat it. Okay? He's in a collapsing building. He's laying in a bed. He's helpless. He can't move. So he says to his disciples, take everything out of the house. The furniture, the pots, the pans, out. And when you finish, carry my bed out. So his foolish students do exactly what he says. They empty the house, there's nothing left, they pick up his bed, they carry it across the threshold, and the house collapses. True story. What gave him the right to do that? And the answer is he didn't have a right. He had an obligation. If you're Nachamish Gamzu, you know that the only reason houses stand is because God holds them up. Not because of bricks, and not because of friction, and not because of the laws of gravity and the distribution of weight, because of God. If he says, take my bed out first, he's failing his test of faith. Now you are not allowed to do that. You have to get out of that building quickly, because you're not him, and he's not you. So Yosef HaTzaddik's level requires it. And we learn it from this story of Yosef HaTzaddik. So that's why Nachamish Gamzu didn't make the same mistake.